The Galactic Empire chose a human warrior until they saw his 70,000 deaths. The selector was already at the fourth candidate when I noticed my dress. Uniform was unraveling at the left cuff. One thread pale against the dark. Fabric hanging loose and patient-like. It had already made its decision and was simply waiting for gravity to finish the job. I watched it while Sorvith Allen pressed his assessment hand against the chest of Bren Voss, a Kaith warrior built like a cargo crane that had developed strong personal opinions about close proximity. Bren Voss stood 3 and taller than me and outweighed me by 60 lb of military grade muscle and whatever Kaith warriors were made of below the muscle layer, which I suspected was more muscle. He carried himself with the absolute stillness of a being who had never once been uncertain about how much space he was entitled to occupy. He looked like what you would engrave on the front of a warship if you wanted to win the argument before the fighting started. I looked like a man whose uniform was quietly resigning. The selection chamber held 200 beings from across 9 imperial sectors. Curved walls the exact color of deep space with the light taken out of it. Ceilings high enough that the upper air had its own atmospheric conditions. Everything coated in a material the Empire's official briefing documents called sovereign-grade obsidian composite, which I understood to mean this room costs more than your planet of origin. Please act accordingly. The crowd had maintained absolute silence since the ceremony began and would continue to do so, the silence of beings who treat their silence as a performance of their own significance. I was the only human in the candidate line. This had been established at the transport dock 40 minutes earlier, where 11 alien soldiers from 7 different species had run through the same consistent sequence of reactions upon noticing me. Initial curiosity, rapid internal recalibration, then the careful professional blankness of beings who have been trained not to visibly react to whatever choices their superiors have made. The Veth-class soldier standing to my immediate left had the most accomplished version of that blankness. It had stopped being an expression long ago and become simply the natural default state of her face. Her name in the candidate roster was Venturol. She stood at attention the way mountains stand, not as a product of effort, but as an expression of what she was made of. I counted the exits when I entered. 4, standard distribution for a floor plan of this type and size. The south entrance had a structural pillar positioned 7 ft to its left that created a dead angle over the first 4 candidate positions, an angle completely invisible from the main security floor. This was not a thought I initiated. It was information my eyes collected and delivered without being asked. The way your foot recognizes the higher step in a familiar staircase before your brain has finished the sentence about it. I had been in this room before, not in person, in simulation, 14 months ago, during an advanced close protection training exercise the program had used. Imperial architectural scans of this exact chamber as the scenario environment. I had run 62 scenarios in a digital version of this room. 31 of them had ended in what the program's documentation called cessation events. Deaths. The program used clinical language. I preferred the accurate word. The thread on my cuff moved gently. The temperature-controlled air Sorvith Allen moved through the candidate line at a pace that understood its own Weight, 7 ft tall, crystalline phase biology. His outer surface refracted light at the edges and produced a faint halo of scattered light that followed him through the chamber whether he preferred it or not. His assessment hand, the left, 3-fingered and softly luminescent at the fingertips with a pale gold light, pressed flat against each candidate's chest for approximately 4 seconds. Withdraw step, next candidate the same. Every time. Read combat resonance, do not attempt to interpret or interfere with the assessment process. I had read the briefing materials 4 times. On the third read, I had made a small note next to this line. On the 4th read, I crossed the note out, not because I disagreed with the instruction, just because I had already memorized it. He worked through the line with the precise rhythm of someone who has performed this ceremony enough times to know that the pace is part of what the ceremony communicates. 1 candidate 4 seconds clean. Withdrawal next. I watched my thread and thought about the east service door, which I had measured by eye during entry, and found to be 2 and wider than the architectural standard for buildings of this age and construction type. Something had been widened after the original build. Something larger than the doorway had needed to pass through at some point after construction was complete, and I intended to find out what before I accepted any extended assignment in this building. The candidate to my immediate right completed his assessment, 4 seconds. Clean. Sorvathalan stepped 1 position to the left. He stood in front of me, his hand pressed against my chest. Pressure first, then warmth, then something below both of those. Reading, a deep one, the kind that does not stay at the surface contact point, the way an experienced mechanic presses his ear against an engine block and hears things through bone that the open air does not carry. It had no direct comparison in my experience. It was not uncomfortable, it simply had no reference point to sit against. 4 seconds. 5. An attendant somewhere in the crowd shifted weight. The sound of it was very loud in a room that had held complete silence for 19 minutes. 6. 7. The thread was now attached by a single fiber. Sorvathalan withdrew his hand. He did not move. He stood in front of me for 2 full seconds after withdrawing, which he had not done for any other candidate in the line. His face was not built to produce expressions the way human faces produce them, but the angle of his posture shifted, the shift of a reader who encounters a word they recognize from a language they have not used in a long time, a half-second of internal search before it connects. Then he moved to the next candidate. 3 more assessments. The ceremony closed. He returned to the front of the line and stood facing all 12 of us. His voice, when he read the names of the selected, had a resonance my inner ear registered as music, and my spine registered as a warning. He named 12 warriors. I was the 7th name called. The crowd made a sound I had not heard a crowd make before, not applause. Applause moves forward, celebrates, closes. This sound moved sideways. It was the collected audio of 200 beings, revising a prior assumption at the same moment, the sound of a room that had prepared for one outcome. And GT clears throat. And GT received a different one and was now working out whether to reclassify the answer or the question. Ventral to my left looked at me once. Her expression had shifted from Professional blankness to something more precise, the quality of attention of a measuring instrument that has not yet displayed its final result. An attendant worked down the line, collecting identification tokens. He reached me, paused a full half second, longer than he had paused for anyone else. Then he carefully took the token from my hand as if it might weigh more than it looked. I should have asked Soravath Allen what he read in my chest during those 7 seconds. I did not ask. The south pillar had a sightline problem that needed to go into the security plan. The east service door had an unexplained modification that was now item 1 on my working list, and my dress uniform's left cuff thread was lying on the floor of the most ceremonially significant room in the Galactic Empire. I walked out with the other 11 candidates and left it there. The walk to the honored wing was escorted. 2 honor guards, 12 new Eternal Guard members, 1 corridor that had been specifically designed by someone who believed that the right angles of a hallway could communicate the weight of institutional power to anyone walking through it. It worked. Even Bren Voss moved through it with something quieter in his posture than he had carried into the selection chamber. An Imperial official named Lion Ices fell into step beside me at the first junction, narrow build, formal dress, data device in one hand, the expression of a being composing his incident report while simultaneously delivering the procedural welcome he had been assigned to deliver. Sergeant Harrow, he said, I am your transition facilitator. Intake processing begins tomorrow morning. Your quarters are prepared in the honored wing, the east service door in the selection chamber. I said, the one that was widened after original construction. I need the authorization records. He stopped walking for exactly 1 step before recovering his pace. I will note that inquiry. Appreciated. He separated from the group at the next junction. I watched him go and kept the door at the front of the list. I found my quarters without assistance. Force of habit, I always prefer to learn a space on my own terms before I need to move through it under pressure. The room was large by military standards, and probably exceptional by any civilian standard I had previously operated under, but I spent the first hour mapping it by sight line and dimension, and the second hour pulling building schematics from the intake terminal. The east service door had been widened 11 years ago. The authorization listed the reason as maintenance equipment. Access modification. The maintenance equipment specifications in the following record would not have required a 2 in expansion. I added it to the working file, closed the terminal, and was asleep in 4 minutes. I had learned a long time ago to sleep efficiently when you have died 70,000 times and each death leaves its own particular echo in your nervous system. The nights get long if you let them. You learn not to let them. Their clerk 7 arrived at my door at precisely the hour the intake schedule specified, which I marked as a positive indicator. He was short by Imperial standards only, slightly taller than me, with a compact build that suggested his species had evolved in a high-gravity environment and had been adapted since. He had 4 arms, 2 for primary tasks, 2 kept folded at chest height, with a natural ease of a being who perpetually expects to need to take notes. He carried a documentation case and an object I did not immediately identify. Sergeant Harrow, he said. His standard was formal and his pronunciation was precise in the way that comes from deliberate practice rather than native fluency. I am Clerk 7, Intake Division. I will be managing your full transition. Documentation. Dell, I said, what is that? He looked at the object in his lower right hand, a beverage vessel, he said. Does it work? A pause, thoughtful. It does not, he said. The internal seal degraded some time ago. I keep it for reasons I have not fully articulated to myself. I found Clerk 7 immediately tolerable. We set up at the room's main table with his documentation system and what turned out to be 947 intake forms which the Empire had apparently designed on the understanding that any being worth placing in the Eternal Guard could be fully described by 947 discrete data points. I did not dispute the underlying logic. I disputed the category structure in Sections 3 and 5. Medical history, he said, opening the first major section. Significant physical events in the past decade, events that affected your operational capacity for periods exceeding 24 hours. I looked at the category. That will take some time. Clerk 7 had a stylus in one upper hand and the non-functional beverage vessel in the other lower hand, and he looked at me with the patient attention of a being who had processed a great many unusual files and had learned not to react to the first indicator that a particular file was going to be one of them. How much time? That depends on the level of granularity you need. He made a note. We moved on. 3 hours in, we had covered service history, combat clearance, psychological baseline assessments, and a 40-page physiological standard section that required 19 manual system overrides because the intake database had not been built with human biology as a standard input type. Clerk 7 handled each override with the methodical precision of a being whose relationship with procedure was strong enough to survive contact with reality. He adapted quickly. I revised my initial assessment of him from immediately tolerable to genuinely competent, which in my experience is significantly less common than people who work in large organizations like to believe. We worked through 4 more sections: insurance designation, kinship, notification protocol, weapons systems, familiarity ratings, specialized training documentation. Clerk 7 recorded everything without comment, and when the system failed to have a category for something, he created one, which is a skill that requires a specific kind of confidence that most people undervalue. Now, he said, arriving at what his system labeled Section 5, primary service record, I need to access your full military file from the Human Defense Consortium database. The access request was filed at your nomination. It should be available. He navigated several screens. Yes, loading now. 1 moment. I looked at the beverage vessel sitting at the edge of his workspace. It was roughly the shape of a standard thermal container, but the design had introduced a structural indentation near the upper third that served no function I could identify. Decorative possibly, or a failed prototype for a feature that had worked differently in theory than in production. There was a small scratch along one side, clean at the edges, recent enough that the material had not oxidized around it yet. The terminal chimed. File loaded. Clerk 7 began reading. I watched the vessel. He was silent for 23 seconds. I counted. Sergeant Harrow, he said. His voice was still professionally. Level almost. Dell, I said. This figure, he turned the terminal. Toward me, though I did not need to see. It, 70,412. This is a pause of genuine length. Is this a ranking metric, a unit of cumulative service measurement? Death count, I said. Silence. Combat simulation deaths, I said. Imperial Defense Directorate's Advanced Close Protection Training Program. 40-month enrollment. You enter the scenario, you run it when you die in the scenario, the program resets and you run it again from the beginning. The number is cumulative across the full enrollment period. He looked at the number on the screen. He looked at me. He looked at the number again with the expression of a being doing the same. Arithmetic 3 times because the first 2 results could not possibly be correct. 40 months, he said. Yes. Each scenario reset is registered as a cessation event in the program's medical log. That is correct. So the program logged 70,412 cessation events. 70,412 deaths, I said. The program uses clinical language. I use the accurate word. Clark 7 set the stylus down on the table, very carefully with the deliberate precision of a being making sure that at least one object in his environment was behaving predictably. He picked up the non-functional beverage vessel. He stood up. I need a moment, he said. His voice had gone very flat in the particular way that flatness is used when it is functioning as a replacement for something else entirely. I will return shortly. He left the room. He took the vessel with him. I sat alone at the intake table in the quiet of an imperial administrative building going about its ordinary business, and I looked at the terminal screen still showing my file. The number was visible from where I sat. I did not need to look at it carefully. I had looked at it enough times over 40 months that it had stopped registering as large. It was a count, the way a carpenter knows how many boards he has cut without the number feeling like either an achievement or a wound. It was just the record of work that had been done. Through the open door, the corridor, sounds of the building moved past. Voices in languages I recognized and some I did not. The hum of climate systems running slightly louder than their specifications, which indicated a filter maintenance issue that the schedule had let develop past its service window. The particular sound of imperial administrative foot traffic, which moves at a pace that suggests the work is important enough to warrant urgency, but organized enough not to require it. I thought about the beverage vessel, the indentation near the upper third, whether it was structural or aesthetic, whether someone had made a deliberate choice to put it there for how it looked, or whether it was the remainder of an original functional design that had been abandoned halfway through the engineering process. These were very different things. There was no way to determine which one without more information. Clerk 7 returned 18 minutes later. He was not carrying the vessel. He sat down, retrieved his stylus, and aligned it parallel to the edge of the data device with the same precision as before. He had composed himself. Professional blankness was back, but it was sitting on top of something now, and both of us could tell. I apologize for the interruption, he said. You do not need to, I said. I have made a notation in your file, indicating that Section 5 requires escalated review by intake division. Senior staff, he paused. The High Command intake liaison has been notified of a priority item. Today's processing queue. I appreciate you telling me. He looked at me for a moment. The question behind his professional expression had not gone away. It was simply waiting. The training program, he said. 40 months, 70,412. Yes. And you completed the program. Top of my cohort, I said. He wrote something in the documentation. His hand was steady. We will continue with Section 6, Weapon Systems. Familiarity Ratings. We continued with Section 6. At the end of the session, when Clerk 7 had collected his materials and was preparing to leave, he stopped at the door. He looked back at me. The vessel, he said, from my workspace you were studying it. Yes. It is decorative, he said. Internal mechanism was never functional. It was a gift from a colleague who understood the category incorrectly. He left. I sat in the empty intake room for a moment after he was gone, looking at the terminal and the corridor and listening to the filter hum that the maintenance schedule had allowed to develop past its service window. Then I heard boots in the corridor. A lot of boots, moving at the specific pace of beings who have been given a destination and a clear reason to reach it without delay. I straightened in the chair and waited for the knock. The room on the 14th floor of the command tower had been designed by someone who believed strongly that the right ceiling height could do the work of 6 armed guards. The vault was high. The walls angled slightly inward at the top, and the combined effect made every occupant very precisely aware of how much space they were and were not entitled to take up. The table was oval, 20 ft long, and held 14 beings, one of whom was me. I had been in the room for 6 minutes before anyone addressed me directly. The other 6 minutes had been spent on a conversation about me conducted as though I was not present. I recognized the strategy. I did not find it hostile. If you want to understand how a person manages being managed, you watch what they do with their hands during the part of the meeting where no one is looking at them. I mapped the exits. 3, 1 main door behind my position. 1 service access to the left of the vaulted wall. 1 emergency egress behind a panel on the right side that the architectural seaming made visible to anyone who spent the first 6 minutes examining the room structure rather than its occupants. The emergency panel had been installed. Post-construction. The seam pattern told you that clearly. The floor plan's original design had not included it, which meant the security requirements for this floor had changed after the building was complete, and I added the question of why to the back of the working list. The panel consisted of 4 Imperial generals, 2 researchers from the Ethical Oversight Directorate, Sorvith, Lan at the far right of the table, and notably positioned apart from the military contingent, and a being at the far left whose structure resembled large crustacean in formal attire, and whose role the morning's briefing had identified as Imperial Legal Counsel. His name was Counsel Driss. He had 7 limbs and the most methodically organized stack of data tablets I had seen in any Imperial space, which I noted as a professional indicator. The general at the center of the panel was Thal Vesk. He was tall even in a Room full of tall beings, and his rank. Insignia had been accumulating for a long time. He had looked at me once. Since I entered, once was enough. His look had the quality of an assessment that stores its result without broadcasting it. Sergeant Harrow, he said, this review was convened to establish clarity on several items in your intake. Documentation, you are here as a participant in that process. Understood, I said. The figure recorded in your medical history, the general to Thavasks. Left, whose name the seating layout listed as General Orenvask, leaned forward slightly. 70,412. Training cessation events. Our medical division has flagged this figure for biological plausibility review. The flag is still open. The number is accurate, I said. We do not doubt the number, Orenvask said. We are questioning the framework that produced it. What part of the framework would you like explained? Thavask answered. The Human Defense Consortium's Advanced Close Protection Training Program. Specifically, the use of neurological simulation that registers biological death markers in the subject while generating the full experiential and cognitive data set of cessation. You die, I said, in the simulation. Your body processes it as death, cardiac arrest, full neurological shutdown sequence. The program then resets the biological processes. You come back, you carry the information from that death forward. You snorts run the scenario again with that information. A pause held in the room. You experience the death, said the ethical oversight researcher on the right, a tall being whose name I did not have from the seating layout. She had been taking notes continuously since I entered and had not asked a single question yet. Her voice was careful in the specific way that careful voices become when they are carrying something heavy. Each time, the complete physical and neurological experience of cessation. Yes. 70,412 times. Yes. Over 40 months. Yes. She set her stylus down, picked it up, made a notation that she did not look at. After writing, Counsel Driss had been silent until now, organizing and reorganizing his data tablets with the focused energy of a being that uses physical arrangement as a thinking mechanism. When he spoke, his voice had the precision of legal language designed to mean exactly what it says and nothing additional. Sergeant Harrow, I am required to ask, formally for the record, did you find these training experiences to be psychologically harmful or traumatic in nature? I looked at him. Yes, I said. Across the table, postures shifted. The small release of a box being checked. A framework being confirmed. That is not why I kept returning to the program, I said. The posture shifts reversed. The room did not become loud. It had already been quiet. What changed was the quality of the silence, the way a room changes when a statement arrives that requires everyone present to revise the question they have been using to understand all the previous statements. All 7 of Counsel Driss's limbs went still. Please clarify, he said. It was harmful, I said, painful in ways that are not easy to describe. The neurological reset is not clean. The echoes remain. I remember all of them. Not with clarity, not as complete scenes, the way you remember a house you lived in a long time ago, in weight and pressure and temperature, not in images. All 70,412 That is a real cost. I am not dismissing it. I looked at the emergency egress panel. Seam on the right wall. The program works, I said. Each death produces a scenario data set. Each reset gives you information the previous run did not have. You accumulate the angles and the distances and the timing and the errors and the variance, and you accumulate them through consequence rather than through description. By the end of 40 months, I could protect a principal in a room I had never physically entered because I had died in 200 rooms that shared its structural characteristics, and I knew every way those rooms could go wrong. My instructor called the decision to continue past the first 100 deaths. Crossing the first fence, he said it had nothing to do with bravery. He said it was a particular kind of stubbornness that either lived in you or did not. Valvesk had not looked away from me since I started speaking. The trauma is the cost, I said. Operational data is the return. I ran the arithmetic. General Orenvast said most beings would consider that arithmetic unacceptable. Yes, I said. That is why I finished at the top of my cohort. The ethical oversight researcher on the right set her stylus down again, and this time she did not pick it back up. The trauma is ongoing, she said. You carry the memory of 70,000 deaths, and you are still carrying it. Yes. And you would do it again. My instructor, Pete Gallo, had told me on the first day of enrollment that the program had an 81% attrition rate before death number 200, not because of physical limits, because the human mind has a protection mechanism that resists recording its own death as useful data rather than as catastrophe. And to override that mechanism requires making a choice that the mechanism is specifically designed to prevent. He had called it the first fence. He had said that getting over it had nothing to do with not being afraid. I did not explain any of this to the panel. I would do it again, I said. The room held that in the air. Counselor Driss's voice, when it came, was careful. Are you afraid of death? Sergeant Harrow. I looked at the emergency panel seam. I thought about all 70,412 of them. I remember all of them, I said. One beat past, clean and alone. No, I said. Sorvathalan, at the far right of the panel, looked at me. He was the only being in the room who appeared to have understood the answer. The tribunal continued for another hour and 20 minutes. The ethical oversight researchers asked 17 more questions. Orenvast asked 12. Counselor Driss asked 9 and reorganized his data tablets twice. Valvesk asked 2. At the end, Valvesk looked at the table for a moment, then at me, then at the table. The active threat assessment for the Sovereignty Council Protection Detail has a 72-hour timeline, he said. You are assigned as primary protective agent. Solo deployment, full briefing package will be delivered to your quarters within the hour. Understood. Is there anything you require before deployment? The full authorization records for the East Service door widening in the selection chamber, I said. 11 years ago, the original engineering specifications and the sign-off chain. Valvesk looked at me for a long moment. You will have them. I stood and moved toward the main door. Sergeant Harrow. Sorvathalan's voice, he did not continue immediately. I waited. The wait I read in the selection chamber, he said. I want you to know that I have conducted 847 assessments in this role over 40 years of service. I have never once read that specific weight before. He did not say what the weight was. I did not ask. I went to prepare for the assignment. The briefing package described the threat as sophisticated, well-resourced, and 14 days ahead of any prior intelligence estimate. The Sovereignty Council met on the 17th floor of the Assembly spire in a chamber with one main entrance, 2 service corridors, and a council membership that had a strong institutional preference for sitting where they wanted to sit, rather than where a protection plan needed them to sit. I had read this note in the prior security team's documentation 3 times. Each time it was written with increasing exhaustion. I had 6 hours before the session convened. I used 4 of them in the building. The Assembly spire was 32 years old and had been modified 11 times since original construction. Every modification left a record if you knew where to look in the seaming of panels, in the slightly wrong dimensions of corridors that had been widened or narrowed, in the placement of fixtures that did not quite belong in the architectural period of their surroundings. I walked every corridor on floors 15 through 20. I located 4 service access points that the current security documentation did not list. I identified a sight line problem on the main floor approach that would have been caught immediately in any of the 140 simulation scenarios I had run in buildings of this floor plan type. I added them to the security plan and sent the updated document to the deployment coordinator, a liar and I, officer named Fincer, who had the tired efficiency of a being that had been running protection logistics for a long time. She sent back a single-line response. These modifications are noted and appreciated. The council session began at the 10th hour of the imperial day cycle. 12 counselors in a room built to hold 30, seated at a table shaped like the crescent of a moon, attended by 3 administrative staff and 1 protection agent, which was me. Counselor Vethna, who had been identified in the threat package as the primary target, was a compact and precise being of a species I recognized as Aleth, 4-limbed silver-gray in complexion, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending a career making decisions that other people have to carry. She sat at the center left of the crescent, which was not where the security plan needed her to sit. She had been sitting there for 11 years. I stood at the main entrance position and watched the room the way I had learned to watch rooms, not looking at anything specific, but letting the full picture move through me and register its deviations. The service corridor on the left was running a slightly higher air pressure than the right, which meant its ventilation system was operating at a different load level, which meant something was different in the left corridor from what the building management system thought was there. 4 minutes into the session, I moved to the left service corridor under the standard patrol rotation protocol. The corridor was empty and looked exactly as it should look. I stood in it for 20 seconds. 12 degrees, the temperature differential from the main chamber was 12 degrees. The left corridor should have been 8 degrees cooler than the main chamber at this time of the building cycle. 12-minute airflow was being partially blocked somewhere ahead of me. I went left at the junction instead of right on the standard patrol route. I found him at the third door. He was not from any species in the standard Imperial military database, which meant the threat package had been working from incomplete intelligence, which meant the prior 14-day estimate was optimistic. He was well prepared, and he had been in position long enough to have mapped my patrol intervals, and he knew I had found him about 2 seconds before I did, because he moved first. I will not describe what happened in the corridor in detail because the detail is not the point of it. The point of it is that I had died in a corridor like this 117 times in simulation, and I knew all 17 ways it could go wrong, and I was using that information in real time, and he was very good, and for approximately 6 seconds we were exactly matched. He found the angle I had not covered. The impact was on the left side high, and it dropped me. The floor of the assembly spire's left service corridor was cold in the specific way that stone floors are cold when the building circulation system has been running for 30 years and has never fully solved the ground level temperature problem. I registered this with a clarity that had nothing to do with the circumstances, the way your mind sometimes locks onto a sensory detail during a moment of extreme physical stress because that detail is manageable and the moment is not. I thought about Clerk 7's beverage vessel, whether the indentation was structural or aesthetic, whether he had ever resolved the question himself. The clinical death threshold for a human being is defined by the cessation of cardiac and neurological function. The program had taught me exactly where that threshold sat because I had crossed it 70,412 times, and each crossing had been recorded in the program's medical log with a timestamp and a duration. I crossed it on the cold floor of the service corridor. I was on the other side of it for 11 seconds. I know because my training had taught me to count. There is nothing on the other side, no light, no sensation, no awareness, just a gap, a specific kind of absence that is different from sleep and different from unconsciousness, a gap that has a texture to it even in its absence of texture because your nervous system knows the difference between not having information and the information having simply stopped. 11 seconds. Then my eyes opened. The corridor ceiling high, the same temperature differential in the air, the same building hum, the sound of footsteps coming from the main chamber. Fensor's team responding to the alert. My suit telemetry had triggered. I was already mapping the corridor. Before I had finished processing that I was back in it, the left turn at the junction, the 3 doors, the ventilation differential that had told me where to go, the positions of every registered access point between my current location and the council chamber. The threat was contained. I registered this a moment later when I heard Fensor's team confirm it over the communication channel. Counselor Vethnine was safe at the center left position of the crescent table where she had been sitting for 11 years, which was not where the security plan needed her to sit and where she had been sitting anyway. She was alive. That was the only column that mattered. I sat up on the cold floor of the service corridor and waited for the footsteps to reach me. Fensor was the first through the door. She stopped when she saw me. Her expression moved through 3 distinct states in approximately 2 seconds, which I found more efficient than most people managed. "You are," she started. Yes, I said. The telemetry registered a full cessation event, she said, for 11 seconds. That is correct. She looked at me sitting upright on the floor of the corridor. She looked at her data device, which was still showing the telemetry record. She looked at me again. I was already calculating the time needed to complete my incident report before the end of the duty cycle. One of Fensor's team members, standing behind her in the corridor doorway, said something in a language I recognized but did not speak fluently. The tone did not require translation. Hell of a thing, I said. The recovery ward on the 3rd floor of the Command Medical Center had a crack in the ceiling that ran from the northwest corner to approximately 2-3 of the way toward the opposite wall. Shallow and long, shaped like a river I had known once in a county that was very far away from this building. I had been looking at it for most of the first day. The ward was quiet by imperial medical standards, which meant there was still a great deal of sound, but it had a regularity to it that was almost like silence. The equipment rhythms, the staff movement intervals, the conversation patterns that established themselves in any space where people work the same hours in the same rooms for long enough. I had mapped the ward in the first 20 minutes, force of habit. The exits were 4, standard, and the floor's security rating meant they were all monitored, which was fine. I had no plans to use them. On the second day, Fensor came by with the incident report documentation. She was professionally precise and professionally uncomfortable, which is a combination I had encountered often enough to recognize as the default state of competent people who have been asked to process something that does not fit their existing categories. The medical panel cleared you for full operational status, she said, as of this morning. I know, I said, they told me. They also submitted a request to the Training Program Oversight Division for the full technical specifications of the cessation reset process. She paused. The panel lead said, and I am reading directly from the record here, the human subject displays neurological baselines following a confirmed clinical death event that are inconsistent with all prior documentation in the medical literature. That is likely accurate, I said. Fensor looked at her documentation. You were gone for 11 seconds. Yes. And your first registered post-cessation action per the suit telemetry was an environmental mapping sweep. Yes. Before you had fully regained consciousness. I was conscious, I said. My body was running ahead of the full verbal processing. It does that. Has done it. For a long time. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of a being who is very good at her job and is encountering the hard edge of what her job's frameworks were designed to handle. There is an imperial broadcast situation, she said. I want you to be aware of it before you have contact with any general communications. I heard it from the corridor yesterday, I said. Councils of concern, emergency sessions, the question of what I am, the question of what humans are. She corrected. The training program data was released as part of the threat response documentation. It is now in public record. The figure is, she stopped, it is generating a significant amount of discussion. I imagine it is. Some of it is not calm, she said. I imagine that too. She completed the documentation transfer and prepared to leave. At the door she stopped the same way. Clerk 7 had stopped, and I thought briefly about whether this was something that happened to people who had a specific kind of conversation with me. Something that made them turn back at the exit. Sergeant Harrow, she said. Dell, I said. Did it occur to you on the floor of the corridor that you might not come back? I looked at the crack in the ceiling. The river shape, the way it narrowed just before the 2-3 point and then disappeared into the plaster with the abruptness of a water source going underground. It occurs to me every time, I said. She laughed. The third day was quiet, the fourth morning was not. The footsteps I heard in the corridor before the knock were not the measured professional pace of medical staff or documentation personnel. They were slower, more deliberate, with the weight of a being who moves at a pace that communicates that it is in no hurry because it has already decided that it will arrive. Sorveth Allen came through the ward door without knocking, which was not standard protocol, but the ward staff did not stop him, which told me something about the nature of his clearance in this building. He was the same as he had been in the selection chamber, the halo of refracted light at his edges, the unhurried quality of his movement, the crystalline surface that made the wards fluorescent, lighting scatter around him in a way that was probably not comfortable for the other patients. He sat in the chair beside my bed, which was not large enough for him, and arranged himself in it with the pragmatic patience of a 7FT being in a world that perpetually underestimates his dimensions. He did not speak immediately. I looked at the river crack in the ceiling. He looked at the same general region of it, which I did not think was because the crack interested him, but because it was where my attention was. And he was the kind of being who follows that. The broadcast situation, I said, has it resolved? No, he said, it will not resolve quickly. The Empire has an established framework for understanding warriors, what they are made of, what they can bear, what the outer limits of that bearing look like. You are not within that framework, and the Empire does not respond well to things that are not within its frameworks. I know, I said. I read the cultural briefing materials. You read them 4 times, he said. I looked at him. He met my look with the patient quality of a being who has been reading people for 40 years and knows when he has said the right thing to produce the expression he was looking for. I know because I requested your intake file, he said. After the selection chamber, after those 7 seconds, I wanted to understand what I had read. Did the file help? No, he said. The file made the question larger. He paused. The number is difficult for the Empire to hold for beings who live in cultures where death is final and sacred, and where a single training death requires a grief ceremony. The concept of choosing death as a learning mechanism 70,000 times is not disturbing to them the way a new idea is disturbing. It is disturbing to them the way something sacred has been treated without the reverence it requires. They cannot locate you within their moral map. That is their problem, I said, not mine. Yes, he said. It is, but it is a problem that may affect your assignment, your safety, and the reception of every human soldier who comes after you, so I am telling you about it. I acknowledged this. Sorvithellan looked at the ceiling crack for a moment, then he turned back to me. In the selection chamber, he said, When I pressed my hand against your chest, I read something I had not read in 847 prior assessments. He was quiet for a moment, selecting his words with the care of a being who knows when the right word is important and the wrong one is permanent. I described it in my selection report as combat resonance of an unusual depth. That was the language available to me. It was not accurate. I waited. What I read, he said, was the weight of something that has been lost and not replaced over and over and over in a very large number. I have read grief in that position before. I have read loss. This was not the same. He paused. It was not grief, was it? He said. It was not quite a question. I looked at the river crack, the way it narrowed at the 2-3 point, the way it went underground without finishing, the county it reminded me of, which had a name I had not said out loud in several years. I do not know what to call it, I said. There was a fence early in the program, a decision point. My instructor described it as the place where most people stopped, not because they could not continue, because their mind had a protection mechanism that was working correctly, and to continue you had to make a deliberate decision to step around that protection. The mechanism exists for a reason. It keeps most people from accumulating the kind of information I accumulated. Sorvithalan listened. After you cross that fence, I said, the dying is still there, every single one, but something changes in what it means. It stops being a catastrophe that happens to you and becomes a data set that belongs to you. The fear does not go away, but the fear changes shape. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you, and the carrying becomes familiar, and the familiar becomes I stopped. Yours, Sorvithalan said. Yes. He sat with that for a moment. I read that, he said. In the selection chamber, the weight of a very large amount of loss that has been absorbed and carried and made into something that belongs to the person bearing it. I have no word for it in any language I speak. I do not believe the Empire has such a word. We do not have a clean word for it either, I said. I have heard it described different ways. Instructors call it seasoning. Command calls it operational maturity. Soldiers who have been through the program and come out the other side do not usually call it anything, they just use it. Sorvithalan stood from the undersized chair with the same pragmatic patience he had used to sit down in it. He stood in the wardroom in the scattered light from the ceiling fluorescence and looked at me with the expression of a being who has spent 40 years reading people and has finally encountered a reading he cannot summarize. The Empire chose you, he said. I chose you. I want you to know that what I read in that chamber was not an accident or an error in my assessment. I knew it was significant even when I could not name it. I still cannot name it, but I chose correctly. I know, I said. He moved toward the door. Sorvithalan, I said. He stopped. The East Service door in the selection chamber, I said, the one widened 11 years ago. The authorization record said maintenance equipment. The maintenance specifications did not support a 2-in expansion. I never received a satisfactory answer on what actually passed through it. He was quiet for a moment. That is classified at a level of your current clearance, he said. I know, I said. I want you to get me that clearance. He looked at me. You will have it, he said. He left. The wardroom was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after a significant conversation, not empty but settled, the air slightly different in its weight than it had been before. I looked at the crack in the ceiling and thought about the river it resembled, which ran through a county in eastern Ohio that I had not seen in several years, through terrain that the people who grew up there described as nothing special, and that I had spent significant portions of 40 months of dying thinking about with a precision that surprised me. I was 34 years old. I had died 70,412 times. I remembered all of them the way I remembered that county, not in images, not in full scenes, but in weight and temperature and the specific pressure of familiar ground under familiar weather, in the feeling of knowing a place, because you have been in it often enough, that it has become part of the geography of what you are rather than something you simply visited. The empire could not locate me within its moral map. I understood why. Their moral map was built on the assumption that loss diminishes what you are, that each subtraction leaves less behind, that the appropriate response to encountering the edge of what a living being can bear is to step back from it, to protect it, to build the grief ceremony and honor the threshold and hold the line of what is permissible. I had stepped over the threshold 70,412 times and come back 70,412 times, carrying the information. That did not make me fearless. It did not make me invulnerable. It did not make me immune to the weight of what I had accumulated or to the echoes that lived in my nervous system and did not plan to leave. What it made me was someone who had run out of things to fear about the specific edge they had crossed, someone for whom the fence that stopped most people had become simply a part of the path. The empire did not have a word for that. Neither did I. But Sorvithulin had read it in my chest. In 7 seconds on the floor of a ceremonial chamber, and he had chosen me, and Counselor Vethnan was alive at the center left of her crescent table, where she had been sitting for 11 years, and the building's filter maintenance issue had still not been addressed on. The floor above me and the crack in the ceiling ran like a river from the northwest corner to the 2-3 point and then went underground without finishing. I looked at it for a long time. I did not think about anything in particular. I thought about the river in Ohio. I thought about whether Clerk 7 had ever fully resolved the question of whether the beverage vessel was structural or decorative, or whether he had simply decided that some questions were better carried than answered. I thought about the fence, the first fence and all the ones after it, and the specific quality of stillness on the other side of them, not peace, not resolution, just the particular silence of someone who has been through enough of a specific thing that the thing has become ordinary, and ordinary things do not carry the weight that unfamiliar things carry, and without that weight you can move at a different speed. A nursing staff member came through at the end of the day cycle to complete the standard vitals check. She was Lyra-like. Lyra nice ass but younger, and she moved through the ward with the quick efficiency of someone who has too many rooms to cover and not enough shift to cover them in. She checked my readings, made her notes, and was almost at the door when she stopped. She looked back at me. "You are the human," she said, "from the broadcast." "Yes," I said. She looked at me for a moment with the expression I had been receiving for Several days, the expression of a being trying to reconcile two things that the same framework should not be able to hold, not hostile, not afraid, simply working on a problem that did not yet have a solution. Does it hurt? She said, carrying all of that. I looked at the river crack. Yes, I said. She nodded slowly, as though this was the answer that made the most sense of everything she had heard, and left. The ward went quiet. I was still mapping the exits. Force of habit. I was never going to stop.